On the morning of November 24th, 1971, the United States was preparing for one of the busiest holidays of the year. Thanksgiving was just around the corner. Across the country, millions of Americans were finishing work early and getting ready to travel to see their families and friends.
Back then, airports were completely different from what we know today. There were no advanced security scanners, no complex electronic checkpoints, no strict security procedures. Almost anyone could walk into an airport, buy a ticket with cash, and board a plane within minutes.
And nobody saw a problem with that. In the early 1970s, commercial air travel was still viewed as a safe and elegant way to travel. But on that particular day, someone was preparing to exploit every one of those weaknesses. At Portland International Airport in Oregon, a man entered who looked no different from any American businessman of that era.
He was of average height, relatively slim, appeared to be in his mid-40s. He wore a neat dark suit, a clean white shirt, and a simple black tie. His face carried a calm and trustworthy appearance. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't constantly looking around, and he wasn't trying to hide himself. Instead, he looked like a respectable man preparing for a short business trip. He approached the airline counter, pulled out $20 in cash, and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle. It was a very short flight, less than 30 minutes. The name he gave the ticket agent was Dan Cooper. A simple name, an ordinary name, one of thousands that pass through airport desks every day. He requested nothing unusual, asked no strange questions, and raised no suspicion. He received his ticket, then calmly walked toward the departure gate. Decades later, investigators would try to reconstruct every minute of his movements inside the airport. But there was one problem. Nobody had been watching him. There had been no reason to. To everyone around him, he was just another passenger. Yet while people around him were focused on their luggage, their flights, and their families, he carried in his mind a plan that would later become one of the most famous criminal mysteries in American history. He sat quietly in the waiting area. No one knows what he was thinking in those moments. Was he nervous? Was he afraid of failure? Was he reviewing his plan one last time? Or was he completely confident in what was about to happen? There are no answers, because the man who entered that airport left behind no diary, no recordings, and no confession. All that remains are fragments of witness accounts collected after his disappearance. When boarding began, he stood calmly and picked up his small black briefcase. It looked completely ordinary, but it would later become one of the most important pieces of the entire case. He boarded a Boeing 727 operated by Northwest Orient Airlines. At the time, it was one of the most commonly used aircraft in the United States, and it possessed a unique feature not found on most other airliners, a feature that no one imagined would play a crucial role in the crime that was about to unfold. He chose a seat near the rear of the aircraft, sat down quietly, and placed his briefcase beside him. Other passengers boarded one by one: businessmen, students, families, people traveling home for Thanksgiving. None of them knew they were sitting near a man who would soon become an American legend. The aircraft departed nearly on schedule and began its short journey to Seattle. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Flight attendants moved through the cabin. Passengers read newspapers. Some chatted with their neighbors. Others stared out the windows at the clouds. As for Dan Cooper, he seemed remarkably calm. He ordered a drink,
lit a cigarette, and quietly observed the cabin. Later, one flight attendant would recall something unusual. She said the man didn't seem like someone improvising. Instead, he appeared to know exactly what he was doing, as if he had boarded that airplane with a precise plan for every step. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't anxious. His calmness would later make the entire event even more unsettling. Most criminals become unpredictable under pressure. But this man acted as though he were carrying out a mission he had rehearsed dozens of times. As the flight continued, no one knew the countdown had already begun. Within just a few minutes, this quiet passenger would make a very small move. A move that would change everything. He would not draw a weapon, he would not shout, and he would not directly threaten the passengers. Instead, he would simply hand over a small note, a note that would pass from his hand into the hand of a flight attendant. A note that would mark the beginning of one of the strangest disappearance stories of the 20th century. At first, there was nothing to suggest that Northwest Orient Flight 305 was any different from countless other flights. The aircraft was cruising calmly through the skies over the state of Oregon. The engines were operating normally, and the passengers had settled into the routine of a short domestic flight. Some were reading newspapers. Some were chatting with the person beside them. Others stared out the window at the gray clouds stretching across the Pacific Northwest. As for the man sitting in seat 18C, he seemed calmer than anyone else on board. He sat back comfortably, smoking his cigarette slowly. Watching the cabin with steady, observant eyes, he didn't talk much. He didn't try to attract attention. It was as if his very presence had been designed to go unnoticed. But beneath that calm exterior, a plan was already in motion. A plan that may have taken months to prepare, perhaps even years. No one knows. Meanwhile, flight attendant Florence Schaffner was carrying out her normal duties, moving through the cabin, answering passengers' questions, making sure everyone was comfortable. Then suddenly, she noticed the man near the rear of the aircraft extending his hand toward her. He was holding a small, folded note. He handed it to her quietly. He said nothing, and his face showed no unusual expression. In those days, flight attendants frequently received notes from male passengers trying to start conversations, so Florence assumed it was a phone number or a flirtatious message. She took the note and slipped it into her pocket without reading it, then turned to continue her work. But only a few seconds later, she heard his calm voice behind her. "Miss, you'd better read that note." She stopped, turned toward him, and for the first time, she felt that something wasn't right. The man wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. His tone was strangely calm, too calm. She pulled out the note, opened it, and read the words written in clear handwriting. "I have a bomb." In that instant, it felt as though the world had stopped. The sound of the engines disappeared. The voices of the passengers faded away. And only those 3 words remained in her mind. "I have a bomb." She looked up at him immediately. But the man wasn't acting like criminals in the movies. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. Instead, he sat there calmly, as if discussing an ordinary matter. Then he pointed to the seat beside him and asked her to sit down. She knew that any reckless reaction could put every life on board at risk, so she sat beside him. And there began one of the strangest conversations in American aviation history. Speaking in a very low voice, he told her he was not joking, and that he wanted her to deliver his instructions to the captain immediately. Then he added something that made the situation even more terrifying. He said he was prepared to prove what he was saying. He asked her to look inside his briefcase. At first, she hesitated, but she had little choice. Carefully, she opened it. She looked for only a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough. Inside, she saw several red cylindrical objects connected by wires, a battery, and components that appeared to be part of a detonating device. She wasn't an explosives expert, but she knew one thing. If the bomb was real, then the life of every person on that aircraft was now in the hands of this man. She slowly closed the briefcase, trying to remain calm. As for Dan Cooper, his expression never changed. He behaved as though he were simply asking for another cup of coffee, and that was when the flight attendant realized something truly frightening. The man didn't seem scared. The man didn't seem uncertain. The man didn't seem insane. He seemed like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And that was the most terrifying part, because a nervous criminal might make a mistake, but a calm criminal is often far more dangerous. Cooper pulled out another piece of paper. This one contained his demands. They were written with remarkable precision, as if he had prepared them long before boarding the plane. No improvisation, no hesitation, no changes to the plan. Everything was specified. Everything was calculated. When the pilot later read the note, he immediately understood that this was no empty threat. They were facing a real hijacking, a hijacking being carried out by a man who appeared to have studied every detail in advance. Inside the cockpit, tension spread quickly, but back in the passenger cabin, no one knew anything. Children were laughing, passengers were talking, flight attendants were trying to behave normally, while only a few meters away, a man carrying what could be a real bomb had taken control of the entire aircraft. Strangely, Cooper never demanded to address the passengers, nor did he try to frighten them. He seemed determined to keep everything calm, as if his goal was not chaos, but the completion of a specific mission with as little attention as possible. Yet the question echoing through the cockpit was even more alarming than the bomb itself. If this man had planned everything so carefully, what exactly did he want? Meanwhile, as the aircraft continued its journey above the clouds, the tension inside the cockpit grew with every passing minute. The captain and his crew now knew they were facing a real hijacking, and the danger was not only the man sitting behind them. It was whatever was inside his briefcase. Was it a real bomb or an elaborate bluff? No one was willing to risk finding out. At the same time, the flight attendant continued carrying messages between Dan Cooper and the cockpit, and everyone who spoke with him noticed the same thing. The man was unusually calm. He did not shout. He did not constantly threaten people. He did not behave like the criminals people were used to seeing in movies. Instead, he spoke like a businessman discussing an important deal. But behind that calm demeanor, there was a carefully constructed plan. When his demands reached the captain, they were read more than once, not because they were complicated, but because they were incredibly precise, specific, deliberate, and carefully thought out. Dan Cooper wrote, "I want $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready when we land." That was all. At first, some people thought something was missing. Were those really all of his demands? Where were the political statements, the ideological messages, the slogans? At the time, most hijackings were connected to political motives. Some hijackers wanted transportation to another country. Some wanted publicity for a cause. Others sought negotiations for the release of prisoners. But Dan Cooper asked for none of those things. He never mentioned politics. He never attacked the government. He never promoted any cause. All he wanted was money and parachutes. That was when the real questions began. Why 4 parachutes? If he planned to jump alone, why would he need 4? Was he planning to take hostages with him? Would he force a crew member to jump alongside him? Did he have an accomplice waiting on the ground? Or was there an even smarter reason behind the request? In fact, investigators would later realize that this may have been one of the most brilliant parts of his entire plan. Because when authorities heard that he wanted 4 parachutes, they immediately assumed he might take a hostage during his escape. As a result, they could not risk providing him with defective or fake parachutes. If they did, an innocent hostage could die. And so, without ever mentioning hostages, he effectively forced authorities to provide him with real equipment. It was an extremely clever move. So clever that some investigators considered it evidence that the man possessed extensive experience in planning and special operations. But the bigger question remained: why exactly $200,000? Today, that amount might not seem extraordinary, but in 1971, it was an enormous sum. Equivalent to millions of dollars in today's money. Yet he did not ask for 1 million or 10 million. He requested an amount that could be gathered quickly, as if his objective was not to obtain as much money as possible, but rather an amount he could realistically carry and escape with. Everything suggested he had thought through every detail beforehand. The weight, the size, the timing, the authorities' response, even the psychology of the people negotiating with him. As news spread across the ground, the emergency response rapidly expanded. Information reached airline executives, then local law enforcement, then the FBI, then federal officials, and before long, dozens of government agencies were monitoring the flight in real time. The entire nation was watching a single airplane and a single man. Yet the surprising part was that Cooper never seemed rushed. He could have shouted, issued threats, created panic, but he did none of those things. Instead, he remained seated calmly, ordered another drink, lit another cigarette, and gazed out the window, as if he were an ordinary passenger enjoying the flight. His behavior puzzled everyone. Even the flight attendants struggled to understand him. He was a hijacker, yet he behaved unlike any hijacker they had ever encountered. One of the flight attendants would later make a statement that caught investigators' attention. She said, "I never felt that he hated anyone. He wanted the money, but he did not seem to enjoy the fear he was causing, nor did he appear eager to hurt anyone. And that only deepened the mystery. Who was this man? A professional criminal? A former soldier? A former pilot? An intelligence operative? Or simply an ordinary man with extraordinary courage? As these questions circulated through everyone's minds, Dan Cooper waited patiently. He knew the aircraft would soon reach Seattle. And he knew that the most dangerous phase of his plan had not yet begun, because obtaining the money was never the final objective. It was merely one step. The real step was what he intended to do after he got the money. And that part of the plan was so outrageous that many people refused to believe he would actually attempt it. But before the escape could begin, American authorities faced a critical decision. Would they comply with all of his demands, or would they try to stop him before he ever left the airplane? At that time, the plane was slowly approaching Seattle, but the problem was that no one on the ground was prepared for what was happening. In 1971, there were no advanced protocols for dealing with hijackings as there are today, and authorities had not faced many similar cases at this level of organization. So, communications began pouring in from every direction. The pilot contacted air traffic control. Air traffic control contacted the airline. The airline contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI contacted federal officials. Within minutes, dozens of government offices were trying to make a single decision. What do we do about Dan Cooper? Time was passing quickly, and the aircraft could not stay in the air forever. As for Cooper, he seemed to understand that very well, as if he knew that time was working in his favor. Every passing minute increased the pressure on the authorities and raised the likelihood that they would agree to his demands. In the cockpit, a new message from him arrived. It was simple and clear. If the money and parachutes were not ready upon landing, he would begin taking further action. He did not specify what those actions would be, but he didn't need to. The presence of a suspected bomb on board was enough, and so the authorities began leaning toward the only available option: complying with the demands. In the city of Seattle, the following hours turned into a frantic race against time. Bank employees began gathering the requested money. It was not easy to collect $200,000 in cash in such a short time, especially since Cooper had not requested checks, nor had he requested bank transfers. He wanted real physical cash. Money that could be carried and escaped with. And while the money was being collected, another team began searching for parachutes. And that was not simple either. The hijacker had requested 4 parachutes, 2 main ones, and 2 reserve ones, and they had to be ready in an extremely short time. Every minute mattered, because the plane was circling above the area awaiting instructions, and with the delay continuing, fuel levels were gradually decreasing. Therefore, it was decided that the plane would continue circling over Seattle until preparations were complete. Down below, the entire city was mostly unaware of what was happening. People were shopping, restaurants were full, families were preparing for Thanksgiving, while directly above their heads, a hijacked aircraft carrying dozens of lives was circling, and inside it one man was paralyzing an entire state apparatus. But what most astonished investigators was not his demands. It was his personality. All reports from the flight attendants were consistent. The man was polite. The man was calm. The man did not appear to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The man did not shout. The man did not act insane. He even used phrases like please and thank you. One investigator would later say he behaved more like a professional businessman than a criminal. And that is what made the case strange, because everyone was used to seeing criminals in a state of panic. But Dan Cooper seemed to be the calmest person on board. At one point, he requested a meal. Yes. While almost the entire United States was in a state of emergency, the man who hijacked the plane was calmly eating. That level of confidence was frightening, because it suggested only one thing. The man believed his plan would succeed. He may even have been completely convinced of it. And after hours of tension and waiting, the long-awaited news arrived. The money was ready, and the parachutes were ready, and the fuel truck assigned to refuel the plane was in place. Everything Cooper had requested was now available, and here everyone realized a bitter truth. He had won, at least the first stage. The man who boarded the plane with a $20 ticket had forced the United States government to comply with his orders, and when the plane finally began preparing to land in Seattle, everyone believed the end was near.
But the truth was different, because the landing was not the end of the operation.
It was the beginning of the most dangerous part, the part that would turn the case from an ordinary hijacking into one of the greatest mysteries in American history. When the plane's wheels touched the runway, police cars were everywhere, and federal agents were watching the scene from various distances. Snipers were ready for any emergency, but inside the plane, Dan Cooper was still in full control of the situation, and the question that occupied everyone's mind was, after he gets the money, what exactly will he do? Will he release the passengers? Or has the most dangerous part of the nightmare not yet begun? When the aircraft finally came to a stop on the runway at Seattle Airport, darkness had already begun to take over the sky. The yellow lights reflecting off the rain-soaked tarmac gave the entire scene a strange cinematic atmosphere. Outside, police vehicles were positioned around different parts of the airport. FBI agents watched the aircraft through binoculars. Inside the plane, silence filled the cabin. Everyone was waiting for the next move. No one knew whether the coming hours would end peacefully or in disaster. The ransom delivery began with extreme caution. Airport employees approached the aircraft carrying the bags containing the demanded money. $200,000 in cash. Thousands of carefully arranged banknotes. The FBI had meticulously recorded the serial numbers of every bill. They knew those numbers might one day become the only way to track the man down. At that moment, they had no idea those bills would later become one of the most mysterious pieces of evidence in the entire case. The money was brought on board. Then the 4 parachutes arrived, and this particular moment worried the authorities more than anything else. Until now, no one knew why Cooper wanted 4 parachutes. A terrifying possibility circulated among investigators. What if he planned to force a crew member to jump with him? What if he intended to use a hostage as a human shield? Every possibility was on the table, but they had no choice. They had to comply with his demands. Once Cooper confirmed that both the money and the parachutes had arrived, he did something no one expected. He ordered all the passengers to leave the aircraft, just like that. Without hesitation, without additional conditions. Suddenly, the nightmare was over. For the dozens of people on board, passengers began leaving one by one. Some still had no idea what had really happened. Others had only just realized they had spent hours aboard a hijacked aircraft. As their feet touched the ground, many began to understand the magnitude of the miracle they had experienced. They had survived, but while the passengers were leaving, investigators were focused on something else. Dan Cooper made no attempt to escape. He did not try to blend in with the crowd. He did not try to disguise himself. Instead, he remained inside the aircraft, as if he were still waiting for the most important phase of his plan. That was when authorities realized something frightening. The man did not want the money alone. If money had been his only objective, he would have fled the moment he received it. But he didn't, which meant there was another part of the plan, a far more dangerous part, a part no one had anticipated. After the passengers departed, only a small number of crew members remained on board. The captain, the first officer, the flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant. As for Dan Cooper, he sat near the middle of the cabin, surrounded by the money and the parachutes. He was now closer than ever to achieving his goal, yet he showed no signs of excitement. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He did not behave like a man who had just obtained a fortune. Instead, he remained as calm as he had been from the very beginning, as if the money were merely a tool to reach something else. Then came the moment that stunned everyone. Cooper sent new instructions to the cockpit. He told the pilots exactly what he wanted after takeoff. When the captain read the instructions, he could hardly believe them. In fact, he asked to read them again, because what the hijacker was demanding made little sense to most people. He wanted the aircraft to take off again, not to a nearby city, not to a neighboring country, but on a long nighttime flight toward the south, at a relatively low altitude, at a specific speed, with very particular aircraft settings. It all seemed incredibly strange. How could an ordinary man know such technical details? How did he know the correct speed? How did he know the ideal altitude? How did he know so much about the Boeing 727? These questions began circulating through the minds of investigators. Some started reaching a troubling conclusion. Perhaps Dan Cooper was not an ordinary criminal. Perhaps he had aviation experience, or military training, or advanced technical knowledge of aircraft, because an ordinary passenger does not speak this way, and does not request such precise flight configurations. As discussions continued, the captain tried to persuade him to modify some of the details. But Cooper knew exactly what he wanted. He was calm, determined, as if he had rehearsed this moment dozens of times before it happened. Outside, FBI officials felt their frustration growing. They had been given a golden opportunity when the aircraft landed, yet they had been unable to arrest him. Now he was preparing to take off once again, and with every passing minute, their chances of capturing him grew smaller. As for Dan Cooper, he was moving closer and closer to the final stage of his plan, the stage that would either make him a legend or leave him as an unidentified body somewhere among the forests and mountains. No one knew which outcome was more likely. But everyone understood that whatever happened after takeoff would be anything but normal, because no rational person who had already obtained the money he wanted would choose to remain inside the aircraft unless he intended to do something unimaginable. And as the engines began preparing for departure once more, one terrifying question dominated everyone's mind. If escaping through the airport was never part of his plan, how did he intend to disappear once the aircraft was back in the sky? After receiving $200,000 and 4 parachutes, Dan Cooper ordered the aircraft to take off once again, but this time, his goal was not to reach another city. He was preparing for the most daring part of his plan. He instructed the crew to fly at a low altitude and a specific speed. Details that led investigators to believe he had a solid understanding of aircraft operations. As the flight continued through the darkness and the storm, he ordered the crew members to remain inside the cockpit. Then he stayed alone in the rear of the aircraft. Only a few minutes later, the pilots felt a sudden jolt. A jolt that investigators believe marked the exact moment Cooper lowered the rear staircase and jumped into the void. On a cold night, in the middle of a heavy rainstorm, above thousands of square miles of forests and mountains, and from that moment on, no one ever saw him again. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in American history. Aircraft, helicopters, soldiers, FBI agents, and thousands of hours of investigation. But the outcome was astonishing. Dan Cooper was never found. Neither was his body, nor his parachute, nor the bag containing the ransom money. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The years passed, and the case gradually became a national mystery. Then, in 1980,
A young boy discovered a portion of the ransom money buried near the bank of a river. Investigators confirmed through the serial numbers that the bills were part of Dan Cooper's ransom, but the discovery did not solve the case. Instead, it made the mystery even deeper. The money had appeared, while its owner remained missing. Over the following decades, the FBI investigated dozens of suspects. Some were pilots, some were experienced parachutists, others had committed crimes strikingly similar to Cooper's. Yet investigators were never able to prove the true identity of Dan Cooper, and the central question remained unanswered. Did he die that night, or did he actually succeed in escaping? In 2016, after more than 44 years of investigation, the FBI officially closed the case, not because the mystery had been solved, but because it could not be solved. And to this day, no one knows who Dan Cooper really was. No one knows where he landed, and no one knows whether he survived or died. But one fact remains certain. In 1971, an unknown man boarded an aircraft, hijacked it, collected the ransom money, jumped from the sky, and vanished forever. And perhaps, somewhere, there was once an old man watching documentaries about Dan Cooper, smiling quietly because he was the only person who knew the truth. Enjoyed the story? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. See you very soon.